This is my true story. At 92 years old, I moved into my son's mansion, thinking I'd finally rest after decades of building the business that made him wealthy. But within weeks, he had me waking at 6 every morning to cook and clean and serve his family like hired staff. Made me scrub toilets and wash dishes while his wife watched television. Introduced me to his dinner guests as the help instead of his father. But what he didn't know is that I have something that can destroy his life. But you won't believe what I did next. Before I tell you, tell us where you're watching from, and please subscribe so more people hear this story. Raised my son Michael completely alone from the time he was 6 years old, after his mother walked out on us without warning. Left a note saying she couldn't handle being a mother anymore and needed to find herself somewhere far away from family responsibilities. Became both father and mother to a confused little boy who kept asking when mommy was coming home. Had to explain over and over that she wasn't coming back while trying to hide my own heartbreak and anger. Promised Michael that night I'd give him everything he needed, that he'd never feel the loss of his mother because I'd work twice as hard to fill both roles. Poured every ounce of energy into building my import business so I could provide Michael with opportunities I'd never had growing up poor. Worked 18-hour days for years, establishing relationships with suppliers overseas and building a client base that would sustain us. The business grew slowly but steadily over 2 decades, eventually becoming successful enough that I could afford private schools for Michael and a nice house in a good neighborhood. Sacrificed my own comfort and health to make sure Michael had tutors and sports equipment and everything other kids from wealthy families took for granted. Paid for Michael's entire college education at an expensive private university without him needing to take a single student loan. Wrote checks for $60,000 annually so he could focus on his studies instead of working part-time jobs like I'd done. Bought him a car when he graduated, helped him get his first apartment, gave him seed money to start his own business ventures. Set up a trust fund for him when he turned 25 with $500,000 so he'd have financial security no matter what happened with his career. Watched Michael become a successful businessman in his own right by his early 30s, building on the foundation I'd provided with the education and capital and connections I'd worked myself nearly to death to give him. He'd gotten married to a woman named Diane from a wealthy family, bought a mansion in an upscale neighborhood, had 3 children who attended the same expensive private schools I'd sent him to. Felt enormous pride seeing him achieve the comfortable life I'd always wanted him to have. Thought every sacrifice had been worth it to see my son thriving. Never remarried after Michael's mother left because I'd devoted all my time and energy to raising him and building the business. Didn't have space in my life for another relationship when I was working constantly and managing single parenthood. My social life disappeared as friends moved on with their own families, and I spent weekends at Michael's sports games or helping with homework instead of going out. The business and my son became my entire world, the only things I cared about or invested in emotionally. Started having health problems in my late 80s after decades of stress and overwork caught up with my body, developed heart issues and arthritis that made living alone increasingly difficult. Michael would visit occasionally and seemed concerned about me managing by myself, would comment on how the house wasn't being maintained properly or how I looked thinner than I should. Told him I was managing fine, but truthfully, I was struggling with basic tasks, couldn't climb stairs easily or carry groceries or keep up with housework. Michael suggested I sell my house and move in with him and his family when I turned 90, said they had plenty of space in their mansion, and it would be better for me to be around family instead of isolated and alone. The offer seemed generous and loving, exactly what a devoted son would do for an aging father who'd sacrificed everything for him. Felt grateful that he wanted me close, that he valued having me as part of his daily life after all the years I'd spent raising him alone. Sold my house and moved into Michael's mansion 2 months after my 92nd birthday. Brought only my personal belongings and some furniture that held sentimental value. Signed over the house, proceeds to Michael as an early inheritance. Thought I was being practical about estate planning and helping him financially. Had no idea I was funding my own prison, giving away the last bit of independence I had to the son who decided his elderly father's only value was as free domestic labor. The first few days after moving into Michael's mansion felt normal and loving. He'd set me up in a guest room on the second floor with nice furniture and my own bathroom, treated me like a father visiting his successful son. We'd have family dinners together where I'd sit at the table with everyone. Michael's children would talk to me about school and activities. Diane would ask politely about my health and comfort. Thought this was how the rest of my life would be, surrounded by family who cared about me and wanted me present in their daily lives. Everything changed about 2 weeks after I'd moved in, when Michael came to my room early one morning around 6 and told me the family needed breakfast ready by 7 because the children had early activities scheduled. Said it casually like he was asking me to do a small favor. Didn't frame it as an order or expectation, but just a request that I could help out since I was living there. Made scrambled eggs and toast for everyone that morning, thinking I was contributing to the household, being useful instead of just taking up space in their home. But the next morning, Michael knocked on my door at 6 again with the same expectation, and the morning after that, and suddenly making breakfast, became my daily responsibility instead of an occasional favor. Then Diane started adding requests for me to clean up after meals since I was already in the kitchen. Said it made sense for me to load the dishwasher and wipe down counters while she got the children ready for school. Within a month of moving in, I was responsible for all breakfast preparation and kitchen cleanup every single morning. The responsibilities expanded gradually over the following weeks, Michael or Diane adding new tasks to my daily routine with explanations about how it helped the household run more smoothly. Started being expected to vacuum the common areas and dust furniture, to clean the bathrooms I wasn't even using, to do laundry for the entire family, including folding and putting away clothes. Was spending 6 to 8 hours daily doing housework at 92 years old, while Michael and Diane both worked from home offices doing nothing physical. Michael moved me from the nice second-floor guest room to a small converted storage room in the basement after about 2 months. Said they needed that bedroom for Diane's mother, who'd be visiting frequently. The basement room was barely large enough for a twin bed and a small dresser, had a tiny window near the ceiling that let in almost no natural light, felt like a servant's quarters instead of space for a family member. Had concrete floors that hurt my arthritic joints and poor heating that left me cold most nights. They stopped having me eat meals with the family. Instead, I was expected to serve everyone their food and then eat alone in the kitchen after they'd finished. Michael would call me when they were ready to eat, and I'd bring dishes to the dining room, stand there while they ate in case they needed anything, clear plates when they were done. His children stopped talking to me or acknowledging my presence, except to ask for more water or complain their food wasn't hot enough. Diane started treating me like hired staff she could order around, would snap her fingers to get my attention instead of using my name, would give me lists of tasks she wanted completed each day with specific instructions about how things should be done. She'd inspect my work and criticize anything that wasn't perfect, would make me redo cleaning jobs if she found a spot I'd missed or a surface that wasn't polished enough. Spoke to me in a condescending tone like I was stupid or incompetent instead of a man who'd built a successful business and raised a child alone. The worst part was watching Michael allow and encourage this treatment, seeing my son, who I'd sacrificed everything for, standing by while his wife humiliated me daily. He'd laugh when Diane snapped her fingers at me, would add his own criticism about my work being too slow or not thorough enough. Started referring to me as the old man instead of dad or father, would tell his children to ask the old man if they needed something instead of acknowledging I was their grandfather. The humiliation reached unbearable levels when Michael started hosting dinner parties and business gatherings at the mansion, events where he'd invite wealthy friends and professional associates to show off his success and lifestyle. He'd inform me days in advance that guests were coming, and I'd be expected to help prepare and serve throughout the evening, that I needed to make myself useful since I was living in his house rent-free. Made it clear these weren't requests, but requirements, that earning my keep meant performing whatever labor the household needed, including entertaining his guests. The first dinner party I worked was devastatingly humiliating when Michael introduced me to arriving guests not as his father, but as the help, or sometimes just the old man who lives here and helps out around the house. Would gesture at me dismissively while explaining to his friends that I handled household tasks in exchange for room and board. Framed our arrangement like I was lucky charity case he'd taken in, rather than his father who'd funded his entire privileged life. His guests would glance at me with pity or discomfort before moving on to more interesting conversation topics. Michael made me wear an actual apron during these gatherings, a white server's apron like restaurant staff wore, so guests would clearly understand my role in the household. I'd stand in that apron at 92 years old, serving drinks and appetizers to people young enough to be my children, carrying trays through the mansion I'd helped purchase with money from my life's work. Would hear snippets of conversation about business deals and investments, topics I'd taught Michael about when he was young, while I was treated as invisible furniture there to serve and clean. His friends would discuss business strategies I'd pioneered in my own company decades earlier, Michael presenting these ideas as his own innovative thinking without ever mentioning he'd learned everything from his father. Would listen to him take credit for approaches and philosophies I'd spent years teaching him. Watch him receive praise and admiration for wisdom that came directly from lessons I'd given him. Nobody at these parties knew the servant in the apron had built the foundation for everything Michael had achieved. Diane was even worse during social events than she was in private, would snap her fingers at me in front of guests and bark orders like I was a disobedient dog she needed to keep in line. She'd say things like, "Old man, clear these plates and make it quick. You're embarrassing us moving so slowly with your arthritis," loud enough for everyone to hear. Guests would look uncomfortable witnessing an elderly man being spoken to with such contempt, but nobody ever said anything or questioned why Michael's household staff was a frail 92-year-old man. One particularly awful evening, Michael had me serve drinks at a party for his business associates, important people he was trying to impress with contracts worth millions. I'd been on my feet for 5 hours already preparing food and setting up, my legs aching and back screaming from the physical labor my 92-year-old body couldn't handle anymore. Stumbled slightly while carrying a tray of wine glasses, didn't drop anything but my hands shook from exhaustion and pain making the glasses rattle. Michael came over immediately and grabbed my arm roughly, pulled me aside into the kitchen away from his guests and hissed at me to get myself together or go to my room. Said I was making him look bad in front of important people, that if I couldn't perform basic tasks properly, then I shouldn't be out there at all. His anger wasn't concern for my well-being or acknowledgement I was struggling, just irritation that his elderly servant wasn't functioning smoothly enough to maintain the impression he wanted to project. Went back out and continued serving, despite the pain and exhaustion, because I had nowhere else to go, no option except endure whatever treatment they decided to give me. Spent the rest of that evening watching Michael laugh and network with successful people, watched him live the comfortable life I'd worked myself to death to provide, while I shuffled around in an apron being treated like disposable labor. His guests probably went home thinking Michael was successful, but somewhat cruel for how he treated his elderly help, never knowing that help was the father who'd sacrificed everything to create the life they were admiring. Stayed silent and swallowed every humiliation, every cruel word and degrading task, because the terrifying reality was that I had absolutely nowhere else to go at 92 years old. Had no other family members still alive after outliving my parents and siblings over the decades. No close friends remaining after years of focusing solely on work and raising Michael left me socially isolated. Most people I'd known from my business days had either died or lost touch during my retirement years. The professional network I'd built had dissolved once I was no longer actively working. Had sold my house and given the proceeds to Michael thinking I'd spend my remaining years living comfortably with family who loved me, never imagining I'd need an exit plan from my own son's home. The money from the house sale was gone, absorbed into Michael's accounts, leaving me with just my monthly Social Security check that wouldn't cover rent for even a small apartment. At 92, with health problems and no significant savings outside the trust accounts Michael managed, I was completely financially dependent on him for housing and basic care. Thought constantly about leaving but couldn't figure out where I'd go or how I'd survive on my own. Couldn't imagine managing daily tasks like grocery shopping and cooking and cleaning when my body barely functioned well enough to do those things for Michael's household. The arthritis made every movement painful. The heart condition meant I tired easily and needed to avoid stress. Couldn't realistically live independently. Without help, I couldn't afford to hire. Was trapped by my age and health and poverty in a situation that was destroying what little dignity I had left. Every night I'd lie in that small basement room on the uncomfortable twin bed, listening to footsteps and conversations happening in the floors above me, feeling like a prisoner in a dungeon instead of a family member living with relatives. The room was cold and damp. The concrete floor hurt my joints. The tiny window barely let in enough light to know when morning had arrived. Would stare at the ceiling, wondering how the little boy I'd raised with such tenderness and sacrifice had grown into a man capable of treating his own father like disposable labor. Tried to understand where I'd gone wrong in raising Michael, what I'd failed to teach him about compassion and respect and family loyalty that allowed him to see nothing wrong with making his 92-year-old father scrub toilets. Had I spoiled him too much by providing everything he'd wanted? Had I failed to model proper values by working constantly instead of spending more time on character development? Blamed myself for his cruelty, even though I knew intellectually that his choices were his own responsibility as an adult. The isolation was almost worse than the physical labor, spending entire days completing household tasks without anyone speaking to me except to give orders or criticism. Michael's children had been instructed not to bother talking to me since I was busy with my work. Diane treated me like furniture that happened to move around cleaning things. Michael himself barely acknowledged my existence except when he needed something done. Felt invisible and worthless, like I'd been erased as a person and reduced to just a function. Thought about death often during those months. Wondered if dying would be easier than continuing to endure this humiliation day after day. Would lie in bed at night feeling my heart beat irregularly and almost hoping it would just stop, that I'd go to sleep and not wake up and finally be free from the prison my life had become. But some stubborn part of me refused to give Michael the satisfaction of dying conveniently in his basement, refused to let him inherit everything without facing consequences for how he'd treated me. Started fantasizing about revenge during the long hours of cleaning and cooking, imagining ways I could hurt Michael the way he'd hurt me or make him understand what he'd done to his father. But at 92, with no resources and nowhere to go, revenge seemed as impossible as escape, just another fantasy to occupy my mind while I scrubbed his floors. Had no idea that the legal structures I'd set up decades ago would give me exactly the tools I needed to destroy his comfortable life the same way he'd destroyed my dignity. The breaking point came on a Saturday afternoon when I was serving lunch to the family, carrying plates from the kitchen to the dining room where Michael and Diane sat with their 3 children. My hands were shaking from exhaustion after spending the morning deep cleaning the upstairs bathrooms, nearly dropped one of the plates as I set it down in front of Michael's 8-year-old grandson, Tommy. The boy looked up at me with curious eyes and asked in the innocent way children do when they notice something doesn't make sense about the adult world around them. Tommy asked why I had to be the servant in the house, why I was the one who cooked and cleaned and brought them food instead of sitting at the table eating with the family. Said his friend's grandfather visited and got treated like a special guest, got the best seat and extra dessert, and everyone wanted to talk to him. Wanted to know why his grandfather was different, why I wore an apron and worked all day while everyone else relaxed. The question was pure and honest without any malice. Just a child trying to understand the strange household dynamics he was witnessing. Michael answered his son without hesitation or shame, spoke in a casual, matter-of-fact tone, like he was explaining something obvious that Tommy should have already understood. Said I was old and useless for anything else except basic household labor, that my body was too broken and my mind too slow for me to contribute in any meaningful way to society. Explained that he was being generous by letting me stay in his house instead of sending me to a nursing home where old useless people usually ended up rotting away until they died. Told Tommy I should be grateful for the opportunity to earn my keep through cleaning and cooking, that it gave me purpose and usefulness instead of just sitting around being a burden on the family. Said some people were meant to lead and others were meant to serve, that I'd moved from the first category to the second as I'd aged into worthlessness. Spoke about me like I was an object being discussed rather than a person standing right there in the room hearing every word, like my decades of sacrifice and love meant nothing compared to the inconvenience of my existence. Diane nodded in agreement and added that nursing homes cost a lot of money that could be better spent on the children's education and activities. that keeping me at home as household help was more practical financially, said it was actually kind of them to give me useful work instead of letting me waste away doing nothing, that I should appreciate having a purpose at my advanced age. The two of them talked about me like I was a clever solution to a household problem, rather than a human being deserving of dignity and respect. Stood there holding an empty serving tray, listening to my son explain to his child that his grandfather was useless garbage being kept around out of practical convenience, felt something inside me shift and harden into cold steel. All the months of swallowed humiliation and accepted cruelty suddenly crystallized into a clarity about what I needed to do. Realized I couldn't spend whatever time I had left living this way, even if it meant risking everything to escape. Tommy looked uncomfortable after his father's explanation, seemed to sense that something was wrong about treating elderly grandparents like servants, even if he couldn't articulate exactly why. He glanced at me with what looked like sympathy or maybe embarrassment, opened his mouth like he might say something else, but then just went quiet and looked down at his plate. Even an 8-year-old child understood on some level that his father's treatment of me was cruel and wrong, but nobody in that family had the courage or care to challenge Michael's authority. Went back to the kitchen and stood at the sink with tears running down my face, 92 years old, crying over dishes while my son explained to his children that I was useless trash who should be grateful for the chance to serve them. That night, lying in my cold basement room, I started planning in earnest how to escape this prison, remembered the legal structures I'd put in place decades ago, and realized I still had power Michael didn't know about. His treatment of me was about to cost him everything he thought he owned. What Michael didn't know, because he'd never bothered to carefully read the legal documents I'd had him sign over the years, was that the $8.2 million sitting in various accounts and investments he believed belonged to him were actually held in a trust structure I'd established 40 years earlier. When I'd started becoming financially successful with my import business in my 50s, I'd worked with estate planning attorneys to create an irrevocable trust that would protect assets and minimize tax liability when eventually passing wealth to Michael as my sole heir. The trust documents named me as primary beneficiary and trustee with full control over all assets during my lifetime, giving Michael access and management rights but not actual ownership until after my death. I'd done this partially for tax reasons, but mostly as insurance against exactly the kind of situation I now found myself in, protecting myself in case Michael ever turned against me or proved unworthy of inheriting everything I'd built. My attorney had advised me that maintaining legal control was smart planning that gave me options and flexibility as I aged. Over the decades, I'd funneled most of my business profits and investments through this trust structure, building the $8.2 million portfolio that funded Michael's comfortable lifestyle. The mansion he lived in was purchased using trust funds with my approval. The investments he managed were technically trust assets he had permission to handle. Even the business ventures he claimed as his own successes were started with capital I'd provided through legal agreements that kept ultimate ownership with me as trustee. Michael had been given checkbooks and investment account access and authority to make financial decisions as the trust's designated manager, functioned in practice like the money was his to control and spend as he wished. But the legal paperwork I'd carefully maintained over 4 decades kept the underlying ownership with me, meant that I could revoke his access and redirect assets at any time as long as I was mentally competent and alive. He'd never bothered to have an attorney review the actual trust documents, just assumed that having access meant having ownership. The business he bragged about building from scratch had been started with $300,000 of my capital, given as what he thought was a gift, but was legally structured as a trust-funded investment. The real estate holdings he claimed as his portfolio were purchased using trust funds I'd approved. The stock accounts he managed were investments made with money that remained under my legal control. Everything he pointed to as evidence of his success was built on a foundation of assets that belonged to me. Had maintained meticulous records over the decades of every dollar transferred to Michael, every investment made on his behalf, every asset purchased with trust funds under my authority as trustee. My attorney's office had thick files documenting the paper trail showing I'd never actually transferred legal ownership of anything, despite giving Michael management authority and beneficial use. The documentation proved that Michael had been living off my generosity and my assets while believing he'd achieved independent success. Even the house I was currently living in as a servant was technically owned by the trust, purchased 15 years ago with funds I'd authorized Michael to use for his family's residence. The deed was held in the trust's name with me listed as trustee, meaning Michael lived there by my permission rather than through his own ownership. Every piece of furniture, every car in the garage, every investment account he checked daily was connected back to the trust I controlled as primary beneficiary. Michael had forgotten, or never properly understood, that his entire lifestyle was built on a legal structure designed to protect my interests first, had gotten so comfortable with access and control that he'd mistaken it for actual ownership. His arrogance and cruelty had blinded him to the reality that the money he thought he could use to trap me in servitude was actually my leverage to escape and destroy everything he believed was his. The father he'd reduced to scrubbing toilets still held legal authority over $8.2 million and the house his family lived in. Started planning my escape 3 days after the incident with Tommy, asking why I had to be the servant. Spent those days reviewing my options and gathering information about the trust accounts while pretending to go about my normal cleaning and cooking routine. Waited until Michael left for his office Monday morning and Diane took the children to their various activities, giving me a 4-hour window when the house was empty and I could work without anyone watching what I was doing or asking questions about my activities. Called my longtime attorney Gerald Patterson, who'd helped me set up the trust structure 40 years ago and still maintained my legal affairs, one of the few people left alive who remembered who I'd been before becoming the old man servant in my son's basement. Gerald was semi-retired now, but still took my calls immediately when his assistant told him I needed urgent legal help. Could hear the concern in his voice when I explained what my living situation had become. Told him I needed to execute my rights as trustee, to take back control of all assets and cut Michael off completely. Gerald walked me through the legal process step by step over the phone while I sat in Michael's home office using his computer, helped me access online banking and investment accounts that I technically controlled but hadn't touched in years. Started systematically transferring money from joint accounts where Michael had been given access, moving funds to new accounts at different banks he'd never heard of in my name only. Gerald had already prepared new account paperwork at institutions across town, just needed my electronic signatures to activate them and begin receiving transferred assets. Spent 3 days working during the hours when Michael was at his office and Diane was out with friends or running errands, moving money in increments that wouldn't immediately trigger fraud alerts or security protocols. Transferred $2 million on Monday from the main operating account to a new account at a credit union across the city. Moved another $1.5 million on Tuesday from investment accounts into secure savings vehicles only I could access. Wednesday, I liquidated stocks and bonds worth $3 million, converted them to cash, and moved everything into offshore accounts Gerald had helped me establish. The trust documents gave me absolute authority to make these transfers as primary beneficiary and trustee. Every transaction was completely legal and proper under the structure I'd created decades ago. Closed Michael's access to accounts by removing his name from authorizations, changed passwords and security questions to things only I would know. Essentially locked him out of the financial system he'd been using to fund his lifestyle. $8.2 million moved silently through legal channels I controlled, disappeared from accounts Michael checked regularly into new structures he didn't know existed. Gerald also helped me initiate the sale of the house Michael's family was currently living in, the property that was titled in the trust's name, with me as trustee having full authority to sell or transfer at my discretion. Found a cash buyer through Gerald's real estate connections who was willing to close quickly. Someone looking for property in that upscale neighborhood who didn't care about the current occupant's situation. Signed sale documents electronically and set a closing date 30 days out. Gave Michael's family exactly 1 month to vacate before the new owners would take legal possession. Worked methodically and carefully to make sure every transfer and transaction was documented properly. Wanted no question about the legality of what I was doing when Michael eventually discovered his accounts were empty. Gerald assured me everything was ironclad. The trust documents I'd signed 40 years ago gave me exactly the authority I was exercising. Michael's belief that the money belonged to him had been a comfortable illusion I'd allowed him to maintain until he'd proven himself unworthy of inheriting anything. By the end of that third day, I'd successfully moved $8.2 million out of Michael's reach into accounts and investments he couldn't access, had sold the house he was living in, and arranged my own escape. The old useless servant he'd been abusing in his basement had quietly dismantled his entire financial life while he was at work thinking everything was fine. Michael would wake up Thursday morning still believing he was wealthy and successful, had no idea his world was about to collapse completely. Packed my single suitcase Wednesday night after Michael and his family had gone to bed, carefully folding the few clothes I owned and gathering the personal items I wanted to take with me from that miserable basement room. Took photos of my parents and some letters from when Michael was young that I'd saved over the decades, left behind everything else because I didn't need or want anything from this house where I'd been treated like garbage. Laid out the clothes I'd wear for traveling the next morning. Set my alarm for 4 so I could leave before anyone in the house woke up. Sat at the kitchen counter around 4:30 Thursday morning, writing a note to Michael on a piece of his expensive stationery. Wanted my final words to him to be clear and direct about exactly why his life was about to fall apart. Kept the message brief because he didn't deserve lengthy explanation or emotional processing, just needed to understand the basic facts of what I'd done and why. Wrote in my steady handwriting despite my age, made sure every word was legible so there could be no confusion about my intentions. The note explained that he'd made me his servant at 92 years old, treated me like disposable labor in the home I'd funded with my own money, humiliated me daily for having nowhere else to go and no options except accept his cruelty. Described how he'd introduced me to his friends as the help instead of his father, made me scrub toilets and serve meals, while he took credit for business success I'd taught him and funded. Told him I'd heard him explain to his son that I was old and useless and should be grateful to serve his family instead of rotting in a nursing home. Wrote that I'd taken back the $8.2 million that had always been legally mine, according to the trust documents he'd never bothered to read carefully. Moved every accessible dollar to accounts he couldn't access or trace. Explained that the house he was living in had been sold to a cash buyer who would take possession in 30 days, that he and his family had 1 month to find somewhere else to live before the new owners arrived. Told him to consider those 30 days his notice period, the same courtesy employers give employees who are being terminated. Added that he'd treated me like a servant who should be grateful for the opportunity to clean his toilets, so now he could find himself a new servant to scrub his floors after he moved out of the house I'd just sold. Suggested he might also need to find new employment, since the business he claimed to have built was started with capital that had come from the trust I'd now emptied. Made it clear I was taking everything he'd believed was his, because nothing had ever actually belonged to him except by my permission. Ended the note by explaining I was leaving the country permanently, moving somewhere far enough away that he'd never be able to find me or contact me or try to manipulate me into reversing what I'd done. Said I hoped the 30 days would give him enough time to secure new housing and figure out how to support his family without access to the $8.2 million he'd been living off. Signed it simply with my name, no dad or father or any term of affection, because he'd forfeited the right to those titles when he'd started calling me the old man. Placed the envelope containing the note on the kitchen counter next to the coffee maker, where Michael would definitely find it when he came down for breakfast around 7, weighted it down with his car keys, so he'd have to pick it up and read it. Took one last look around the kitchen, where I'd prepared thousands of meals as an unpaid servant. Felt no sadness or regret about leaving, just cold satisfaction that Michael would soon discover consequences for his cruelty. Left through the front door at 5 in the morning, while the house was still dark and silent, called the taxi I'd arranged to take me to the airport, began the journey to a new life on the other side of the world. By the time Michael woke up and found my note around 7, I'd be boarding a flight to Melbourne with his entire fortune secured in accounts only I could access. Boarded a flight to Melbourne, Australia at 8 that Thursday morning, had chosen that destination specifically after weeks of research into countries with excellent aged care facilities that treated elderly residents with dignity and respect. Australia had a well-developed system of retirement communities for people with financial resources, places where my $8.2 million could buy me comfort and proper care instead of just funding my own humiliation. The flight was long at over 20 hours with connections, but I didn't mind. every mile taking me further from Michael and the basement prison I'd finally escaped. Had researched specific retirement communities in Melbourne during those late nights in my basement room when I couldn't sleep, found several upscale facilities that specialized in providing independent living arrangements for wealthy seniors who could afford premium care. One place called Bayside Manor had particularly impressed me with their philosophy about maintaining resident dignity and autonomy. Their website showed beautiful apartments and common areas where elderly people were treated like valued community members rather than burdens. Called them from Michael's office during one of my planning days and secured a luxury apartment with ocean views. The timing of my escape was perfect because by the time Michael woke up Thursday morning and found my note, I was already 10,000 miles away, crossing the Pacific Ocean toward my new home. He'd go to check his bank accounts and find them showing zero balances, would call the investment firms and be told the assets had been liquidated and transferred to accounts he had no access to. His frantic calls and emails would reach a disconnected phone number and bounced back messages. I'd made sure every contact method he had for me would be useless before I'd left. Gerald had set up everything to be irreversible once I'd made the decision to leave. The house sale had binding contracts that couldn't be canceled without massive penalties. The asset transfers were completed transactions that Michael had no legal standing to challenge. Even if he hired attorneys and tried to fight my actions in court, the trust documents clearly gave me full authority as trustee to manage assets however I saw fit. His belief that the money belonged to him had no legal foundation was based entirely on assumptions and access I'd allowed him to have. Landed in Melbourne Friday evening local time, feeling more free than I had in years, despite being 92 and exhausted from 20-plus hours of travel, took a car service directly to Bayside Manor, where staff welcomed me warmly and helped me settle into my pre-arranged apartment. The space was beautiful, with large windows overlooking the ocean, comfortable furniture, a full kitchen I'd never have to cook in because the facility provided restaurant-style dining if residents preferred. Had my own bathroom with safety features and space that felt luxurious after months in a basement storage room. The staff at Bayside called me Mr. Harrison and treated me with respect that felt shocking after months of being called the old man and treated like garbage, asked about my preferences and comfort rather than just ordering me around. Other residents welcomed me to the community and invited me to activities and social events, treated me like an interesting new neighbor rather than an embarrassment to hide. Realized within my first few days there that this was how elderly people deserve to be treated, with dignity and kindness rather than contempt. Gerald called me Saturday morning Melbourne time to report that Michael had been frantically trying to reach both of us, had discovered all his accounts were empty and the house was sold. Said Michael's attorney had contacted him demanding reversal of all transactions, but Gerald had simply forwarded copies of the trust documents showing I had full legal authority for everything I'd done. Michael had no case and no options. His entire financial life had been legally dismantled by his father, who he'd reduced to scrubbing toilets. Sat in my comfortable apartment overlooking the ocean, knowing Michael was probably panicking in that mansion he had 30 days to vacate. Probably trying to figure out how he'd maintain his lifestyle without the $8.2 million he'd been living off. The servant he'd abused had taken everything and disappeared to the other side of the world where he'd never find me. Live now in my beautiful apartment at Bayside Manor Retirement Community, overlooking the ocean in Melbourne, surrounded by staff who treat me with genuine respect and fellow residents who value me as a person rather than judging me by my age or physical limitations. The $8.2 million I took back from Michael funds a comfortable, peaceful life where I have autonomy and dignity, where I choose how I spend my days instead of being ordered around like hired labor. Wake up each morning in a proper bedroom with ocean views and soft, comfortable furniture. No more cold basement rooms or concrete floors that hurt my joints. The retirement community provides chef-prepared meals in a restaurant-style dining room where I'm served by professional staff who call me Mr. Harrison and ask about my preferences, complete opposite of standing in Michael's kitchen wearing an apron while his family snapped orders at me. Can eat whatever I want whenever I want it, never have to cook or clean or serve anyone unless I choose to. Have housekeeping staff who maintain my apartment weekly so I never have to scrub toilets or floors. Can spend my time reading or socializing or simply resting without being treated like I'm lazy or useless. Michael's frantic phone calls and emails from those first weeks after discovering what I'd done all went to disconnected numbers and bounced back addresses. He has absolutely no way to contact or locate me. Gerald reports that Michael hired multiple private investigators to try to find me, but Australia is a massive country, and I use different names on various documents, making me nearly impossible to trace. Even if he somehow located me, Australian law protects me from harassment, and I could easily get restraining orders preventing him from coming near me. Gerald also informed me that Michael's life collapsed completely within weeks of losing access to the money and discovering the house was sold. Everything he'd believed was his disappeared overnight, leaving him with nothing. His business ventures failed immediately, without capital to sustain operations. His luxury lifestyle became impossible without the investment income he'd been living off. Diane apparently filed for divorce within 2 months, once she'd realized the money was gone permanently, took the children, and moved back to her wealthy parents who'd never liked Michael anyway. Michael lost the mansion when the new owners took possession 30 days after I'd left, had to move his remaining possessions into a small rental apartment after spending everything he'd personally saved trying to keep his business alive. Friends and associates who'd admired his wealth and success disappeared once his financial situation became public knowledge. Nobody wanted to associate with someone who'd lost $8 million overnight. The man who'd made me serve drinks at his parties ended up working an actual service job himself. Heard he'd taken a position managing a retail store. His children apparently learned the full story about how he'd treated me from the divorce proceedings, where Diane's lawyers used his cruelty to me as evidence of his character. Judge taking my treatment into account when making custody decisions. They know their father made their grandfather scrub toilets and sleep in a basement. Know he lost everything because he was too cruel and arrogant to treat his own father with basic dignity. Michael's relationship with his children is apparently destroyed. They blame him for the loss of their comfortable lifestyle, and grandmother they never knew was being abused. I'm 93 years old now. Been living in Melbourne for almost a year, surrounded by people who treat me with kindness and respect I deserve. My health has actually improved since leaving Michael's house. The stress and physical labor and emotional abuse had been destroying me faster than age alone. Feel peaceful for the first time in years, knowing I'll never be anyone's servant again. Never be humiliated or degraded or treated like garbage by people who should have loved me. Michael thought I had nowhere else to go at 92, believed my age and lack of resources trapped me in his basement, accepting whatever treatment he chose to give. But I went to the other side of the world with $8.2 million he'd thought belonged to him, left him with nothing except 30 days to find a new servant and a new home. Some prisons you escape by taking the keys with you, and the keys to my prison were the legal documents Michael never bothered to read carefully. He made me a servant, so I took his fortune and freed myself.